produced by CSIS, where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm Evan Brown, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Thanks for listening to the Trade Guys. On this episode, we'll dive into 2 tariff and investment deals with the ROK and the EU, including an effort to make American shipbuilding great again. We also cover the latest in China negotiations. All this and more on the Trade Guys. Okay, welcome back to the Trade Guys, coming to you on the afternoon of Thursday, July 31st. We've got Bill, we've got Scott, we've got another busy week for Tariff Man that we're going to discuss. We've had deals, or at least concepts of deals, with the ROK and the EU. And what has stood out to a lot of people about these deals is that they aren't just about tariff rates, which went down to 15% for both partners, by the way. But there are massive investment pledges from these partners as well. So let's start with Korea, who promised $350 billion in investments in the U.S., and that includes $150 billion in shipbuilding to make American shipbuilding great again, or MAGSA. So Scott, we'll start with you. How far can a deal with Korea go to MAGSA, as they say?
It's an interesting revelation, I think, is the way to talk about it. We've talked about these things as trade deals, and by and large they are. They cover terms of trade, and certainly the sort of the 15% standard, whatever you want to call that. It's the value-added tax that's not a value-added tax. It's a slight improvement in terms of trade, but that's definitely trade policy. But a lot of the other elements have to do with sort of commercial problem solving. And as I see it, Team Trump is showing that there are a couple issues they want to really focus on. One of them is energy exports. Now, energy is interestingly not part of the GATT. It follows the Adam Smith rules worldwide. Hydrocarbons are unique in that respect. They've just never been bargained for in the GATT or WTO system. So there aren't bound tariffs. There aren't any particular disciplines associated with energy trade. But Team Trump definitely wants to focus on U.S.-sourced liquefied natural gas. It does help with the trade deficit, which is, of course, a longstanding Trump complaint. And to the extent that energy purchases are part of the balance of payments, that's good for the U.S. But it's also an area of U.S. worldwide advantage. We have an abundance of hydrocarbons, and in particular, have a technological edge in natural gas. Production of natural gas is an American advantage. So he's focused on that. They tend to pick out sectors where the trading partner has an edge or is expertise, I guess that would be a better way to call it, expertise in an area that the Trump administration has defined as a key national security sector. In the case of South Korea, purchase of liquefied natural gas is part of the deal, as is an investment and what appears to be technology sharing in shipbuilding. Now, Korea has a world-class shipbuilding industry. The United States does not. I guess we have to go back to 1920 and President Wilson, or the autopen version of President Wilson, perhaps. Nobody's really sure who signed the Jones Act, but it's the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, and it restricts the U.S. port-to-port services to U.S.-built ships under U.S.-flagged and U.S.-crewed ships. So because of that law and 100 years of time passing, what the U.S. shipbuilding industry builds a lot of are barges and tugboats, which is what we use on our internal waterways, like the Mississippi River. And we're not really competitive elsewhere. And that's a problem for Congress and for the administration. This may be part of the cure. It's very interesting because it's similar in effect to the Nippon Steel purchase of U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel was an interesting purchase for Nippon Steel because domestic production was part of the Buy America programs, both this administration and the prior ones. But Nippon Steel had technology they could apply to make the U.S. facilities more competitive. And so I think that may be what happens here. It seems like a big industry to turn on a dime, and I'm not sure that'll work. But at least that's a component here. And I find it quite interesting that 15% is basically what people have accepted. It helps make U.S. exports a little more competitive. It helps make U.S. production a little more competitive just by the versus European or Japanese or Korean imports, which were the goals of this program. And then we get this shipbuilding thing, which has the feel of a smart idea that may or may not be too late. We missed the boat entirely, or we're just doing stuff that we should have done 50 years ago?
Like I said a couple of weeks ago, that ship has sailed, I think. And so, yes, we missed the boat on shipbuilding. I think it's gone. I don't think the analogy with Nippon Steel is exactly apt. Nippon Steel took over an operating company that was producing steel that was, I mean, you can argue about its viability, but it was not going to go bankrupt anytime soon, I don't think. And so Scott is exactly right about their commitments, which is to make some technological improvements, but they weren't starting from scratch. Whereas with shipbuilding, we virtually are. And there are shipyards in the United States. In fact, the Koreans own one. The Hanwha company bought the one in Philadelphia, which is a historic shipyard. And, is beginning to get the occasional contract to build more than barges and tugboats. But there's a long way to go. And whether it's going to be possible for the U.S. to restore that industry, or even whether it should, is going to be an interesting question. The fact that if we do it, we're going to do it with Korean money and Korean financing is, I think, clever on Trump's part, because it means the United States is not going to be spending the money. The Koreans are. So if it fails, we're not out. They are. We'll see. I mean, a lot of what he's done with these agreements is to try to bring in other people's money. And that's, if that succeeds, that's fine. I confess to some skepticism, moving off from shipbuilding for the moment. First of all, just on the investments, experience suggests that these investments, and it's not just the Koreans at 350, it's the Japanese at 550, it's the EU at 600. These things start out with great fanfare and great applause by everybody. They rarely end up producing 100% of what's promised. And I don't think it's necessarily because the potential investors are lying. I think it's just that economics and reality get in the way, and differing interpretations of what people agreed to get in the way, which is what I really want to talk about. In the EU case, for example, they committed to $600 billion in investment. It's not clear how much of that is new investment as to how much of it is current investment. That's to be settled. But Commission President von der Leyen said after the meeting she had with Trump that, well, we can work on that, but in the end, that's not EU money. That's going to be private company money. And whether they put it up or not, it's going to be up to them. We can't make them put it up. So, it may be 600. It may be very different from that. Likewise, in the Japanese case, details are dribbling out on all these. There are these summaries, and there are sort of three categories of uncertainty. The areas where the leaders, as it turned out, thought they had agreed to different things, which is going to be a Japanese example I'll get to in a minute. The second case is the things where they kicked the can explicitly and said, well, we'll talk about that later, like on UK with steel, or the EU with steel for that matter, or the EU on digital trade. And then the third category, which is the biggest unknown, is the U.S. going to come back in for another bite and have additional demands later on that were not on the table the first time? So I had a meeting last week with a representative of a foreign government, and I think I may have mentioned this last week, who said, and one of the guests at this breakfast said, this is never going to be over. These things are just going to go on and on and on because so much is not fleshed out. The normal trade agreement is in the neighborhood of 100 pages. These are 2, maybe 3. So there's a lot that's not there. Putting it there is going to be complicated and is going to require more negotiation and probably dispute settlement or litigation. We'll see. So the good news for Scott and me is that we're going to have a lot of talk about going forward. But one example of leadership differences, and this is not unusual when leaders get together. They're not fine print guys. They are big picture guys, and they agree on the big picture, and then they turn it over to their staff to clean up the mess. In the Japanese case, the $550 billion, what appears to be coming out now is the Japanese are saying, well, yes, we did commit to that number, but only $11 billion of that is actual money. The rest is going to be loans, probably from JBIC, the Japanese Bank for International Cooperation, in various forms of financing. But the cash is going to be $11 billion. And when Trump and Secretary Lutnick said, we're going to get 90% of the profit and the Japanese are going to get 10%, the Japanese said that refers to the $11 billion. It doesn't refer to the other $539 billion. So you're getting two different stories here, and eventually they're going to have to sort out which is which. The UK has been trying to get a clear statement out of the administration on steel because their view of the agreement, and this is the one where there is a text, their interpretation of the text is that the United States will ultimately give them basically a tariff rate quota on steel and a better deal than the 25% that they're paying now on steel. They get 10 on other things, but steel is 25. The statement doesn't exactly say it. The text doesn't exactly say that. The U.S. has never confirmed that. So one more thing that remains to be decided, of which there are many. In addition, there are a pile of unknowns. In the EU case, for example, the EU says, well, we've accepted the 15% tariff, but there are going to be exceptions. Well, what are those exceptions going to be? We have no idea.
Well, there were some specific mentions of where there's 0 for 0, for instance, commercial aviation and aircraft parts.
Yes, there was a 0 for 0 there, and they seem to be telling each of these countries that on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, they told the Koreans and the Europeans that it will be 15%, regardless of what we may end up doing in the Section 232 investigations that should be out in the next couple of weeks, so we'll be talking about them when they come out. If you look at the Brazilian case, where it was 50%, there is a very long list of exceptions, as it turned out. Orange juice, aircraft parts, iron ore, which is interesting because it's one of Brazil's biggest exports. Not on the list are coffee and beef. So this is going to hit you in October when you go out for your pumpkin spice latte. You know, you're going to find that it's more expensive because the cost of Brazilian coffee is going to go up, and we'll see how much of that gets passed on. My guess for coffee is that if it's 50%, most of that's going to get passed on. So you've got unknowns like the exceptions. You've got unknowns on, like I said, is the investment new money. You've got unknowns about some of these 232 investigations. It appears that for pharmaceuticals and chips, it won't be 20, whatever he says, maybe 25. The others have been 25. The additional tariffs won't be stacked on top of the 15. They'll be separate or not. We'll have to wait and see about that. And then, of course, there's other 232s coming out. Minerals, aircraft, trucks, drones, and polysilicon, all of which are waiting in the wings. So these things are outlines of agreements. They're concepts of agreements. They're not actual agreements, which means there's an awful long way to go before we have clarity.
Well, yes, I'm sure they'll continue to do the work. I am amazed, though, that the agreement with Europe seems so one-sided because Europe has the lowest growth of any of the major economic units. It's been deindustrializing for some time, mostly due to the high energy costs that were sort of an own goal on the part of the Europeans and exacerbated by the conflict with Russia. And this seems to nudge them further in that direction because basically they're committed to buy U.S. LNG, which is more expensive than alternatives like Qatar, certainly more expensive than the Russian energy they were buying 5 years ago. And some of those investment dollars are going to be used to take by European companies to establish U.S. locations. And here in the U.S., you have a newly established permanent tax law that is very favorable. You have a lot of deregulation happening. Most recently, the change by EPA and the carbon dioxide endangerment finding is going to be a major deregulatory move forward. And finally, a really good use for the friendly folks at DOGE, which is they're taking AI and looking through the entire code of federal regulations and trying to determine which ones are obsolete and duplicative and try to clear house on a systematic basis. So all of that plus our current energy dominance, the current trade measures like the 15% tariff that incentivize U.S. production rather than imports, all of which really looks like this is an assisted suicide for Europe in terms of industrial output. And I don't know how they're going to survive that.
Well, first, if DOGE does as good a job on regulations as they did on destroying the federal civil service, it's going to be a disaster of significant magnitude, I think. But going back to Europe, a lot of the commentary in Europe seems to track what Scott just said. We got taken. I don't think it's that simple. And we'll see how it plays out. As I said, on the investment commitment, it's not clear how much that will end up amounting to. It sounds as though the EU isn't going to can't force companies to do that, so companies will have to decide on their own if it makes economic sense or not. On the LNG purchases, and I don't know the answer to this, if listeners know, they should write in and tell us. The questions that have come up is they've committed to buying $750 billion worth of energy over 3 years. I gather that's about 3 times what they're doing now. And the two questions that have come up have been, one, do we have that much to export? At the same time, the Koreans are going to be buying more and other countries are going to be buying more. Do we really have that much? And two, do the Europeans need that much? I understand Scott's pricing point, but there needs to be a little bit more supply analysis done before we decide how serious that commitment actually is. I also think there's some areas, that didn't get touched. They didn't do anything on the DMA or the DSA, despite pressure on that. They did make a commitment on internet taxation, but I don't think that was something that the Commission was likely to do anyway. On defense purchases, which was another element of the agreement, I would guess that what they agreed to do is pretty much what they were going to do anyway. So it sounds good and is good, I think, but I'm not sure that it's an increment of note above and beyond what was going to happen anyway. And in the end, as this thing rolls out, the question will be, how many exemptions are there? Are there going to be other places where they're going to get a deal? I mean, you have to put it in context, too. As I've said many times, there's no good news in any of these scenarios. There's bad news and less bad news. But I'm inclined to think that the EU deal may be in the less bad news category.
You may well be right, Bill. I did notice that the commentators who were most critical of the European Commission's agreement with the U.S. usually combine it with a couple others. One commentator talked about the hat trick of own goals. Apparently they had a very rough summit with China just a few days ago, and that there was some alienation of Qatar. Qatar is their leading LNG supplier, leading natural gas supplier, I should say, at this point. And there was a squabble over basically the sustainability due diligence rules that Europe is trying to implement. So it was a bad week for European diplomacy.
The thing that just made me sad about it has been, it really represents the normalization of protection and the normalization of tariffs. Back in March, if anybody in the EU had said, well, we ought to take a 15% tariff, they would have been thrown into the North Sea. And here now, they're doing it. The Koreans and the Japanese, their initial ask was, we want 0, and they're accepting it. 15 has become normal, which I think is not good for global growth, not good for global welfare. Our colleague Phil Luck is going to be putting out a paper on that soon, I think. But I don't think Trump cares about global welfare. He cares about American welfare. We'll see if this is better or not. I see inflationary clouds gathering, but it's too soon to say.
Now, of course, there are still countries with no deal at all, or maybe even more vague deals than the ones we've looked at. Mexico just received another 90-day extension as talks continue there. Perhaps the biggest remaining question is, how will things settle out with China? We saw the administration freeze some export controls on important NVIDIA AI chips, industrial magnets, as talks are ongoing about a possible Trump-Xi summit. So, Bill, do you see this as a temporary measure, or is this the start of a real shift in U.S. tech controls, a real relaxation?
Well, I think first the whole thing's going to drag out for quite some time. The deadline was already late. It was August 12th. It went in Stockholm, apparently negotiated a 90-day extension. Trump was supposed to sign off or not on that today. We don't, as of this moment, don't have any word about what he decided. My guess is he'll sign off on it and they'll continue to talk about it. And I think the consensus here, and there's a lot of distress about it, is that export controls have become a card to be played in the trade game, that we put them on to squeeze the Chinese, and then we took them off to unsqueeze the Chinese and try to entice them into a meeting and a negotiation. And so it doesn't seem like the president, at least, has just a firm, absolute commitment to keeping these things in place for national security reasons. There's a lot of people that are upset about that. Both parties in the Congress are upset about it. And it appears there are people inside the administration that are upset about it. Whether it's merely an instrument of a negotiating tactic to try to get a deal going, I think isn't clear, because at the same time that we've been holding off on new controls and pulling back on the H20 chip, which is the one that Evan just mentioned, at the same time, you have hints, not just hints, statements coming out of the administration about what really is a fundamental difference of policy from the last administration. You've got David Sachs, the AI czar, and Secretary Lutnick saying, what we really need to do if we want to maintain technology leadership, if we want to maintain AI leadership, is flood the zone. We want everybody in the world to be buying our tech stacks, to be buying our chips, to be buying our data, building our data centers. And that's the way we keep the advantage over the Chinese. We become the global standard. It brought back memories because that's exactly the same speech I gave about encryption in 1996 and 1997, which ended up being pretty much the administration's policy. Control at the very high end, but at that point, the Clinton administration decided that if the world was going to adopt encryption, we would be better off if they adopted ours rather than somebody else's. And Sachs is saying the same thing. If the world is going to adopt AI in a big way, it's better for us, probably we would argue for them, if it's our AI. That is very different from the Biden policy, for one, on export controls, which was to try to expand the level of controls and keep the high end and define the high end a little lower out of the hands of the Chinese. And the policy that Sachs is articulating and that Lutnick is articulating, Lutnick was the one who said we want the Chinese to be addicted to our chips, which I think is impossible. I think they've decided to go their own way. But
that's a good goal for the Frito-Lay company, but probably not for the IT industry.
Well, the flood the zone strategy, I think, at one level, it makes a lot of sense because it really says as long as we can run faster, we shouldn't spend an awful lot of time trying to trip the other guy. But the point is we need to keep running faster, and that cuts in the research budgets. I'm not sure that we're going to be doing that, but that's an important element of this. But at the same time, a flood the zone policy is not without peril because it increases the likelihood of leakage. And if you start selling a lot of this stuff, particularly the high-end stuff, to countries that are not reliable partners, that are not trusted partners, they're going to end up in China, which if the administration has also said is not what we want. So it's a policy that has certain risks. And the question, of course, is are we choosing our trusted partners wisely? The initial deals have been in the Middle East. Personally, I have some questions about whether that was the wisest place to go. But it does represent not just a tactical move about a trade deal. It represents really a change in the administration's policy about export controls and AI leadership. So I think you have to look at it from both perspectives, not just one.
That makes sense. In the meantime, U.S.-China trade issues are going to be a mess, practically speaking, because the goals are in conflict. We want to decouple, but we don't want to tank our own economy because they're a major trading partner. A lot of things we only source from China these days. And so it takes a while. If you're serious about the decoupling part, you create a lot of disruption on the normal trade part. And if you try to make everything whole on the normal trade part, you slow down decoupling.
Well, and what we've learned just in the last few months, although the Chinese have been signaling this for a couple of years, is that we can't decouple successfully right now because they've got stuff that we don't have and stuff that we need, namely selected minerals, and more important, their ability to process them. Now, eventually, that becomes a declining asset as we and other countries develop alternative sources of supply and alternative methods of sources of production and processing. But right now, we have a problem.
And it takes real work and real capital to change that.
And it takes confronting the NIMBYs.
Yes.
I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, we should do that here. Try to find a neighborhood that wants a lithium processing facility next door. That's not going to be popular. That's one of the reasons why it went offshore in the first place. You know, it's a noisy, dirty, messy business. And people for a long time were very happy to have people across the Pacific on the other side doing it. Looking back, that was probably a mistake. But recovering from it is going to take longer and be more difficult, I think, than people think.
So just sticking with this August 12th deadline that Bill brought up, what do we think happens? I mean, are we looking at another extension? Do we think the nature of a deal that we'd seek with China would be fundamentally different from Korea or the EU?
I think we have another lap of the Trump 500. So we continue to work on it.
No sign of the checkered flag. Is that what you're saying?
No, not anytime soon.
I think that's right. This is going to drag on. It is probably going to be the last one done. Both sides have leverage. I think it's not only going to be many more laps in the 500, but it's going to be like those races. It's going to be the same thing over and over and over again. And the end result is going to be just like 2018. A small package of purchase commitments and a few other things.
Well, I've never been at the Indy 500, but I assume the fans stay in the stands for much of that. So we'll be here. And thanks, guys. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast. For more audio content, visit csis.org/podcast. Thanks for tuning in.